So thank you very much for coming. To give you a little context about Art on Our Mind, the project started last year, and it's an NRF Tutuka Rhodes University funded project. So Art on Our Mind is inspired by Bell Hooks' book Art on My Mind, in which he theorizes on the importance of visuality and various creative visual productions within the African American community. She speaks about art that she experienced as a child. She speaks about the informal ways in which she learnt about art, the formal ways. She looks at the importance of photography in the African American community, and she has a range of interviews with various African American artists. And when I came across that book, for me that was really inspirational. And so I thought, how fantastic would it be someday, if I ever had money, to do something like that for our communities. And that is why I returned reluctantly to academia a few years ago, because this is still where the money is at. Yeah, let's be true. Yeah, so we're not always just doing it for the love. So Art on Our Mind was born from that, and the premise of this is that every 3 months or so we have a public creative dialogue with a South African woman of color visual artist or creative producer. And over those 2 or 3 months leading up to the talk, I have a team of exceptional volunteers from the Department of Fine Art, and they research the artist, and we come up with questions for the artist based on her influences, her inspirations, her working methodologies, the challenges she faces, and then we ask her those sets of questions at our public creative dialogue. And we video it because we put the video along with the transcription, along with the audio, along with every piece of material that we find on our public archival platform. And so what we want to do is to have ease of facilitation, whether it's a high school researcher or it's a professional research scholar, that every bit of material that's available on this artist, that we try to put it online, and we keep this digital archive going. We know how difficult it is sometimes to find material on exceptional artists, even though we in this country are blessed with some of the most amazing women artists who hardly ever have funding but produce out of the love and tenacity of their spirits. There is not enough discourse on them. And as Nonto's work has shown on Gladys and Mdluli in the 60s and 70s, that without that kind of discourse, without us historicizing artists, without the writing, that within even the space of 10 years, you can be completely forgotten. And so the task of writing and putting people into history is an important one. But for the time being, as that history is being written up, we need to make sure that the material will always be available for those who come after us to write. What we also like to do is to talk. So this becomes an occasion for us to talk. And today I'm really, really excited about the kind of panel that I've put together. I'd like to introduce them. Dr. Nomusa Makhubu is an art historian. She's an artist. She's a theorist. You're a curator as well. You're also really a nice person. You really are. And she's based at Michaelis Gallery, Michaelis at UCT. Ms. Nontobeko Ntombela is well known to us, and she is a curator that is based at the Department of Art History at Wits University. She's a lot of other things, which every time I mention, she then refuses. So I'm just going to stick to curator for now. Dr. Mdluli is a curator, an artist, an art historian. Look, the talent. I tell you, and the amount of degrees in this panel. That bad joke, right? More degrees than a thermometer. She is, since the beginning of the year, the director of, is that the right title? The curator at the Standard Bank Gallery in Johannesburg, which is really such an amazing prospect, and we're all very excited about her appointment this year. Ms. Nkule, what we will call Nkule Mabaso, is the curator at Michaelis Galleries. You also do a lot of independent curating as well, Nkule, and it's fantastic to have you here. You don't pretend to be an artist at all. And last but not least is Zodwa Skeyi-Tutani. Zodwa is an independent curator. She also does make artwork, but she's moving more into curatorship right now, and she's doing an MA in curatorial practice here at Rhodes University. And so today we want to speak about the challenges of curating, what that means for South African Black women curators, but also the possibilities of it, because I guess none of us would be doing this if there wasn't the possibilities in it. And so we'll be discussing that. So my first quick question is, can each of you tell us briefly how you came to curating?
Pass the mic. Is it even on? Okay, here we go.
I think it's on now. So I started on the National Arts Festival curatorial committee, which I think at the time it really didn't feel like, I didn't call myself a curator then, because we did work that was part of a team, but just oversaw broadly the exhibitions that would be on at the National Arts Festival. And then, of course, I've learned a great deal from working with Nkule Mabaso, where I think the first major show was fantastic, which I'll speak about at a later stage. And I think that was really valuable for me to start to think about transferring. I think for me the work has always been in the theoretical field, but shifting from the theoretical into the curatorial was something that I think was facilitated by our collaborative work.
It's a very difficult question for me to answer, but I would say my first real experience of curating would be Best Center 2001. Walking in there as a young graduate and working with artists, working at the center. That would be my experience.
I think for me it was sort of accidental, I think, in a sense, because I didn't seek out to become a curator. It kind of landed upon me as a necessity. But I think the first real curating that I did was with the gallery that I started with Johannes, and we put together a little show, but having started it from conception right to showing it as an exhibition.
That's also Same.
Yeah.
So my starting point is I have a BA in fine art, and at the end of the degree I realized that I really don't have the patience and the limitations of sitting in the studio and being self-absorbed, and I was really, the kinds of things that I was interested in were also within what I'd learned in fine art, and my personal practice was just not accessible, so I wanted to expand that and sort of like, how do I become a researcher that engages in wider questions that then are embodied within artistic practice, and so how do I marry those two things? So my interest in research and artistic practice. And so then I embarked on a MA in curating in Switzerland, and this is
So mine started off from being interested in telling stories, and first interest was when I was at Walter Sisulu and watching how people created so much valuable work from literally nothing, and there's literally no things were always broken and things. So, but you see how the stuff that is created out of all of that brokenness. So that's when I came up with the first show that I had called Margins, how working from the margins with a whole lot of black and all the stuff that comes out of that really inspired me. So that's when I basically got the interest in curating.
So I want to quote from an Ngone Fall article. It's called Providing a Space for Freedom, Women Artists from Africa, that was published in the Global Feminisms Catalogue in 2007. And I quote, she says, until the late 1980s, being a female artist was supposed to be a part-time diversion. Women were allowed to be involved in such areas as craft, home, decor, fashion, and hairstyle. And when they did paint, they were supposed to produce pretty canvases to be hung in the home of the local bourgeoisie. No questions, no provocations. They were expected to create decorative beauty, not deal with intellectual theories. By confining them in that narrow role, African societies were in effect denying that a woman could be a full-time artist who addressed challenging conceptual issues. What would your response be to Ngone's assessment of that?
Or maybe she can repeat it. Maybe if you repeat the quote.
Shall I repeat the quote? Now you know what's going to happen. I'm going to just talk a lot faster in my Durban accent now, and I was trying to avoid that on video. So she says, until the late 1980s, being a female artist was supposed to be a part-time diversion. Women were allowed to be involved in such areas as craft, home decor, fashion, and hairstyle. And when they did paint, they were supposed to produce pretty canvases to be hung in the homes of the local bourgeoisie. No questions, no provocations. They were expected to create decorative beauty, not deal with intellectual theories. By confining them in that narrow role, African societies were in effect denying that a woman could be a full-time artist who addressed challenging conceptual issues.
I suppose if one were to shift her quote to thinking about curating, it's always, if you think about the major biennales, that's always been sort of the man's world. Some of the major curators that we can think of, the Nwezels and the Njamis, have sort of defined the so-called African canon, and I think it's made it even difficult for us to shift it. But also very important for us to do that. But it is difficult. I can, from my experience, having worked in these teams, so, Works of Art Curatorial Committee at UCT, but also National Arts Festival, you're outweighed. Right, and there's very little you can do, there's very little movement in terms of how much critical work you can do with your curatorial practice. So I think it is an important question to think, yes, as an artist, but also as curator, but also the limitations, I think, that come with a particular canon that's been created, particularly, especially in relation to African art.
I think what I remember the article to speak to is her trying to map where the practice comes from, but also beyond the kind of scholarly writing, but think about practice in a more expanded sense. So artists who have not actually been considered artists from the Western or modern sense. So the article calls us to think about how do we begin to historicize and think about who's been a player, and to do that, arming ourselves with tools to think outside of what we are finding provided even in archives or books, and saying that the practice that begins to map where women artists are is outside of where the kind of expected spaces, and what that means in terms of even pushing the understanding of who is an artist and what is an artist, and then how do we think about artists who are women.
I think for me, just in the kinds of names of female African artists that I've come across, and I'll take Nkule Mabaso as an example, and how, in a sense, she's also kind of in the way in which she has been written about, but the agency she has kind of placed on herself in both curating her own work, but also a practice. There's a very deliberate, I think, thing she's doing in, for instance, how she's removed herself from the center, very deliberately so, I think, where at a time she was quite at the center of, of those artists that were considered as, in the peripheries, and how she's still, right now, alive and making work, but nobody's kind of paying attention to that, or that, how negotiating then how someone like that enters and is kind of erased in a sense, like you were saying, literally, we haven't heard anything about Nkule Mabaso in the last 10 years or so. We have Dr. Esther Mahlangu, on the other hand, who has been kind of, also now very much, I think, hyper-visualized in a sense.
Packeted.
Yeah, and and that kind of speaks about, again, when and how African black artists, female artists come in and out of the centers, and who kind of dictates that.
Yeah, and also I suppose if you're thinking about artists, black women who were operating in the 1980s, and the basic frame that they wouldn't have named themselves as craft, but they would have been pigeonholed into that. If you look at magicians, they would say in those kinds of exhibitions, so it's not as if they necessarily had a choice in their framing, but this was kind of the operative space in which their work was somehow pulled into and recognized. And so whether they were painting or doing craft, they do get lumped into one area. So yeah, it's also about the time. It's possible within the time frame.
I think it's pretty important that we as black women curators are today doing the kind of work that we're doing, because there's a lot of women that are not visible in the art space because of the fact that they are kind of placed in the margins, and for the kind of work that they create, which is always seen as decorative only, and nothing else is said, which is never always true. I'll testify to the fact that I work with women in the Eastern Cape who do beadwork in rural spaces, and you find that there's so much content in there that is not, that it doesn't really have a platform yet, which I'm trying to create, because the women are always lumped in, like you said, that space where you are either a craft or a touristy attraction or stuff like that. So I think it's very important to have kind of people like us to kind of foreground that work, and yeah.
I think there's something quite interesting about the difference between modern and contemporary, where modern artists were often modern women artists were often put into the sort of craft category, and then contemporary women artists are faced with this predicament of engaging with the critical in terms of their bodies, but again having to engage with spaces where those bodies then become the spectacle. So, I mean, again, I'm going to use Pumla's term here, the hypervisibility, specific type of artists. And I think, you know, often we you know, because they're so hyper visible, those are the only ones that come to mind. I mean, if you think of the Kenyan artist Wangechi Mutu's work, you sort of stuck with the colonial archive. You at once rejecting it, at once critiquing it, but also sort of drawn, and your work is entrenched in it. And I think it's a kind of predicament in terms of what's happened with contemporary women artists that curators often find hard to circumvent, because these have become the canonical artists. I don't know.
I also think, you know, the linearity, you know, as we strive for chronological dating, like to the earliest period, is problematic. Because if we're looking at 1980s, that's very late. So it already means it knocks off people like Gladys Nkule and Chika Okeke Ogulu recently wrote, I mean, he has that fantastic book out on modernism in Nigeria, right? It's such a wonderful book. But he mentions the fact that even in one of the earliest fine arts schools, that there were at least 2 women teachers and are visual artists there. But he literally just mentions their name and doesn't go into dealing with their works. And so we see this long trajectory, but we're actually still writing women out of that history because it's not en masse in the way that it is right now. That we don't have like the huge body that we do right now. But sometimes erasure also becomes a self-perpetuating myth. That even we as, you know, black feminists or as scholars that are actually becoming, I mean, should be held accountable for as well. But Nomusa, to get back to the point that you're just saying, in the same article, Fall also mentions the prevalent use of bodies, particularly their own bodies, by African women. How do you account for this preoccupation?
Well, I mean, it resurfaces a number of, I think, questions. Artists, what you've written about, that burdened, artists constantly being burdened to speak to the past, to speak to these ills. And so I think, if we recall what Okwi reminds us in the 90s, you know, this idea that people were mirroring what is identity. And so where do you start? You start with your own body as a way to reconcile with the way that you are thinking about your practice, and again, I think that responding to a long history of bodies being represented in problematic ways. So how do you regain your own agency, your own voice in speaking about the body and representing it in ways that you want people to engage with it? And so artists, you know, naturally, particularly around the time of the 1990s, there is that turn of people immediately resorting back to speaking from the self and wanting to ask questions about their own identities. The body becomes a starting place. I think obviously over time, artists have complicated what that means and have asked further questions beyond just race, beyond just identity, and asking questions around social justice. So I think I don't want to say it's predictable start, but Ngoni is hinting at a trend that begins to also point at the political moment and asks us to think about, and what she tries to do even in that essay. You know, she's also spoken about it in writing about it, right? The kind of questions she had to grapple with being asked as one author from Africa to write about women artists in Africa and what that actually means. You know, what a responsibility to be asked to do such a thing. So she tries to talk about the problematics and the complexities of place and trying to map those kinds of things, but also in getting closer to artists you was interested in writing and in what they were speaking to.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'm thinking about my own kind of experiences in art training, and I'm taken back to my choice of choosing to go to Wits Technikon as opposed to Wits University. And that was a very conscious choice at the time. But also then looking at, because I had peers and friends that were at Wits University, and we would conversate around, what are the different ways in which we are being taught this art thing. And for me, it was always, and this was something that I noticed even with, if we look at the artists that have come from this, the Wits Tech school, and those that have come from Wits University, and where we've located ourselves, but what also informs our work. And again, I think with Wits Technikon, for instance, there was a lot of that. This was early 2000s. A lot of that encouragement of like looking at yourself, and it also seemed to be kind of encouraged more so for black students as opposed to white students, which was something that also was quite glaring as well, in the classes, as to why are black students being pushed towards, interrogating themselves and who they are, and white students kind of can free range. You can choose anything you wanna, and that was quite a dynamic at the time, yeah.
Yeah, for me, one of the complications when you're working or curating artists' work and they're working with their body in their work, is how do they do this? Because there's sometimes the danger that one might say, I'm intending to be satirical or reverse the image in some sort of way, but in actual fact, without the textual component, what you see is just a reproduced image of this normal or normalized kind of violences that are always perpetuated on those, on black women's bodies. So, while there are possibilities in how the artists work with their bodies, there's also sometimes, for me, a problematic danger when the work is not pushed far enough to take it away from just re-representing in a satirical or metaphorical kind of way the violences or the negative connotations, sort of trying to deal with stereotypes, but in a way reproducing them in the images. And so for me, this is something that comes across quite a lot, and especially in some younger artists, and it takes some time to work through that and arrive at a more resolved way of how do you work with your body. And sometimes that it doesn't happen very well, so yeah, it's problematic.
I'm going to agree with what Usame was saying as well, because also I had the same experiences. I was a PE Technikon, and we were always very few black women students, so we were always the ones that were supposed to present blackness, so you weren't allowed to talk about random things like autism or whatever. Like, you had to speak about how you are rural and have huts in your painting, stuff like that. And so and how you came from this underprivileged background, and so you are grateful to be here amongst the white students. So it always felt like you had to always present your black, especially femaleness, so that, I don't know, you kind of are a witness to whatever black women are supposed to be, and that was a lot of pressure during that time. So I think it stems from that as well during that time.
Another thing that happens, particularly in the 1990s, was this, this moment of autobiographical stances had a lot to do with wanting the immediacy. So performance art, there was a medium shift. So, with other forms of work where, painting become fixed, fixed image of the body, but where artists wanted the reaction, they wanted to see like the engagement with their audiences, and so there was also that medium shift at that particular moment.
We saw that a bit last night as well, right, with the performances, in that with viewers and Michaela's performances and the ululation, that there's just a certain vibe it brings, there's a certain atmosphere with the body being performed live as well. Even though we've seen so much performance art, it still has that impact when it's good. So the next question I want to ask is, in each of your practices at one time or the other, you have shown us a way in which the mute always speak. You've sought out our voices via your curation, or you've highlighted practices or artists that have deserved attention and have gone unnoticed. So for instance, Nonto, you've done this with Gladys Nkule at Valerie Desmond. Salma, you've done this with Fatima Mir's artwork, for instance, which a lot of us are still not very familiar with. Nomusa, your scholarship on Nollywood and Nigerian film, you took Nollywood seriously a long time before many scholars were doing so, and considered them as proper research areas. Zodwa, with your Margins exhibition and the one this year at Steve Biko Center, in each of these, Nkule, you've curated on Helen Sabidi, a retrospective. So, can you tell me about how you came to these interests and what your chosen working methodologies were that? Some of you are working with dead artists, and Gladys apparently is still haunting Nonto. And if Gladys wants to make an appearance at any point, let us know. So tell me about these kinds of recuperative, unearthing and validating strategies that you've used.
I think you should start with Gladys, because now we know she's hunting you.
Maybe to give people context, when I decided to go back to school, when I was working at the DUT Art Gallery, I was constantly interested in what it meant to be a curator, to be a woman curator. Who are these references that I'm placing my work? Of course, I'm shifting my creative practice into this kind of administrative role, but to me the administrative role was not just administration, but it was a creative practice. And so I began my master's wanting to ask, so who are these women artists? Because of course I'd finished a degree without ever encountering black women in the classroom. So I did search, and of course it all started Helen, Noria, and then one or two books had Gladys, and then there was this question mark who she appears and disappears in art history, and there's very little said about her. So she then became this fascination. I wanted to know who she was, and also in her kind of writing into history, whenever she's mentioned as the first. And again, this became a occupation for me. What does it mean to actually call it the first? What is the yardstick that is the measure that's being used here to say then she qualifies to be the first black woman artist to appear in the 60s and 1960s? And so I began to... I wanted to go back to what the first appearance, what was it like, how did she get to become known, and what was this moment? And that became my curatorial project in trying to return to the 1960s, her very first exhibition, and trying to recoup what that exhibition is like, and wanting to present the state it is in now. So it was not around kind of producing a replica of that exhibition, but to present an archive of what that is. And so how do we speak from this moment to understand politically what this meant, to understand what art historically, what this means, who gets written out, And of course, as a result of doing research, I discovered Valerie Desmond, who appears quite early and then leaves the country. So this, again, like this gatekeeping that is happening with art history, and I wanted to reveal that. And so, again, as an infusion of that exhibition of the 1960s, I then introduced Valerie as someone who becomes a question mark in that kind of art history. And of course, the possibility in saying, if Valerie can appear in the 1943, then of course there may be many others that have been written out. And so what is this idea? And we, in South Africa, we have this tendency to want to hone the first, this kind of exceptional naming of things as the first. So this was the starting place, and it was important for me to kind of immerse myself into this journey back with Gladys, and hence, I've mentioned that she haunts me. It was that kind of conversation, but of course, a generational conversation for me, because she's this elder that was asking for answers. So you appear, so how do you appear? I flew to Cape Town, to a parking lot, to that place where she first had the exhibition, to understand what the environment of that place was. I was lucky enough to encounter people who witnessed that exhibition and had to bring in those voices as a way of bringing back her voice into the exhibition space. It was in a boardroom, and how was the boardroom turned into an exhibition space? And so that's Gladys with me.
Okay, so fantastic. So fantastic was really complex. Not maybe difficult, because it was engaging with a number of themes that were part of my doctoral research on Nollywood representational spaces. So the very fact that it was called home video, but that it was seen as something that only women consumed in their domestic spaces. It was seen as something that was consumed by the working class, seen as something that is that's done by young people. So Fantastic really was an intersection of a number of the themes that came out of that, and a number of articles that came out of the exhibition. So we had a number of artists who were engaging with different things, like Zina Sarawiwa, Ken Sarawiwa's daughter, who worked with these television installations, but also this sort of representation of women mourning, which is something you see quite a bit in the video film, in the home video film medium, but also what that representation means. And I think from Zina Sarawiwa's work, the idea of home was then expanded to thinking about the post-colonial nation space or nation state and what place women occupy in it. We often think about post-independence movements, and very rarely do we think about women leaders and where women were in the 1960s transition from colonialism to post-colonial independence. But also, what does it mean for those bureaucratic systems to have either excluded or violated women, which then complicate the way that we're engaging with modern nuclear family structures. So a lot of the work was intersecting with that. Anania, by a Zambian artist, Milumbe Haimbe, also engaged with these sort of reproduction, this patriarchy that reproduced these robotic women to replace biological women. And the biological women formed an underground movement. And the underground movement was meant to sort of infiltrate the factory where these robotic women were being made by men. But all of this happens in the context of post-independence Africa, right? So the place of the biological woman in the Nollywood video film is very precarious, because in many of those films, either women are hunted as witches, or men who want power and wealth make that wealth out of either, so there's a sort of production of wealth and the reproduction of women So they make wealth either out of taking children out of women's wombs, or killing a child, or killing a woman, or sleeping with the corpse of a dead woman, and then you become wealthy. And so, but what did it mean?
The name of this again?
There are quite a few of them. Yeah. So we're working with a number of tropes that then artists took up to represent. And so what did those tropes mean in terms of this construction of the modern nation state in the African context, and the fact that in it women are displaced, but also the fact that this idea of home as nation, home as house, is in itself this precarious space. So a number of artists, I think, that were part of that exhibition were artists who were engaging with very different connected themes, also religion, the religion, or maybe the way in which religious movements, and again, the place of women in those religious movements, but also how religious movements sort of create these states within states. So in Nigeria, for example, you would have, some of the major churches have running water, have electricity, have prenatal services for women, clinics, etc. All the things that you assume the state would provide but does not. And so what happens is you get this sense of this sort of state within a state, or the supranational. But also what they do is that they're so Pan-African and global that they actually trouble the very idea of the African nation state. And I think from that exhibition was this idea of the turning around of Benedict Anderson's notion of the imagined community into the unimagining of the community within the sort of representational axis of the different spaces of Nollywood, which is the home, the television box, and then of course you can span the geographical scale of it. And so I'm trying to think of all the other artists off the top of my head, but I think many of them were engaging with different sort of intersecting ideas around not just where women are, but what are the various political, economic structures that then make our place seem so precarious.
So the Fatima Mia project was part of my master's, my MA. And actually I was very happy to see that last year Constitution Hill, the women's jail, finally, realized what I had been proposing. It's just that again, at the time of doing my master's, there were a lot of challenges, around how I would, how the MA itself would materialize, because the plan was to write a research report and have the exhibition, which only happened last year. And even then I had to kind of, remind them that, look, I prompted this and it was fine, I don't need to be acknowledged as long as it's now done. But the Fatima Mia project was around, so I was working at Con Hill at the women's jail while doing my MA, and I ended up finding these paintings. Only 5 are shown in the actual women's jail, but I discovered there were subsequently 20 more that she had done, and they were watercolor paintings that she was doing in secret, because of course she wasn't allowed to be documenting the prison. But she was doing them under the pretense that she's, painting cards for some of the prisoners that were with her, birthday cards or, Mother's Day cards. But in between that, she would, document some of the things that were happening within the women's prison. Those paintings were subsequently smuggled out of the jail by Winnie Mandela's lawyer. And then they came back into the country. And so my master's was about, again, looking at the narrative that was, the dominant narrative, or the dominant political narrative, and more so a dominant ANC narrative that the women's jail was kind of framed around. And in bringing out these paintings or these other paintings, it was about, again, disrupting that narrative and saying, well, there were other things happening within the jail or the women and in the way in which the women were interacting. For example, there's one watercolor where prison guard and a prisoner are playing cards, which was obviously not allowed, you know. But also the time that she took to paint these, right? It's like, if you look at the detail those were kind of my interests in the actual paintings themselves and what they started to do to disrupt this narrow political narrative that the women's jail had been framed around. And that it would, in bringing them out, it would present a much more fuller account of, you know, that space as, yes, there were women that were held there as political prisoners like Winnie, like Fatima Mia, but there were also ordinary women like prostitutes and, you know, and those women engaged with each other and they interacted, and that should be reflected in the space, in, you know, presenting the space to the public. So that's really what that project was about. And like I said, yeah, I'm glad that those other paintings have since come out. They're now up in the women's jail and presented as part of the, you know, the larger narrative there.
The exhibition with Mayor Helen's video was in 2016, but the conversation sort of began in early 2015, and the idea was to invite her to Michaelis for some workshops and work with having intergenerational conversation with students in the painting department. But she couldn't make it in 2015 because she was working on a new body of work, and so we moved it for 2016, and in that period we decided that we'd also then have this exhibition at Michaelis. So the exhibition was not so much a retrospective as much as it was a presentation of new work that she had made between then 2014 and 16. Yeah, and so by the time that we had the exhibition, it was in the middle of the student protest, so the exhibition technically never opened, and so she also never arrived at the time. So it was the exhibition that never opened, really. So what we were then able to do is like, okay, so we'll maintain the conversation, and so earlier this year, was it a month, 2 months ago, she eventually was able to make it, but also it was in tangent to an exhibition that she was having at the Noble Foundation with Portia, which was more retrospective in dimension. And then we were able to have the conversations and the workshops with the students. But in arriving and sort of trying to then write about the exhibition that didn't happen in relation to Mayor Helen's practice and sort of the way that her career has sort of developed over the years, what's generally been happening is that she would make work and the work would go to the gallery and be for sale, but it sort of is never goes anywhere else, you know. So beyond the commercial, she was technically not very much, her work was not engaged in more critical ways, and in trying to find what's written on her has a very biographical focus that doesn't really touch on what she's doing with her work. And so when the exhibition did not work out so well, so I started working on a paper that was to then contextualize her practice and her paintings and what she attempts to do in that, and that then became those are the part of the basis of the workshops. And so we're trying to sustain an ongoing conversation where we will work on an exhibition that will be maybe a larger retrospective, but it's in the future. So that was that, Sharlene.
Okay, so I'll speak about mine, the one I had at Steviko. It's called Zondi Kondisise, which basically is like a sassy way of saying know who I am. So the exhibition really started out from my obsession with a poet, Nomusa Makhubu, who was a poet during the 1920s, and she's the first woman to publish poetry in isiXhosa. in a newspaper. And how that came about was, she calls herself Imbongi, but she's from Tamaga in the Eastern Cape. But because Imbongi is a performing poet, so who is allowed to call people out on whatever and not be reprimanded. And so she was, her being a woman, she was not allowed to be Imbongi. So I'm thinking because she was friends with Charlotte Makheke, whose husband had a newspaper, she was like, okay, I can do this through the newspaper and not be reprimanded. So she became an Imbongi through a newspaper, which I found extraordinary because she can still call people out and still do what she was not allowed to do in the Eastern Cape through a newspaper and still get what she wanted, you know. And the newspaper should still call herself Imbongi just to like rub it in that, you know what, I'm doing this anyway. So I've been very obsessed with her, but also because I hang out with old people a lot, old ladies a lot, I listen to how they navigate their spaces and their little oppressions, like one lady having to hide money under a rock in order to educate her daughter, and only like 3 people knew about that. And this is how she basically was able to educate 5 grandchildren. And so she was in a way like, well, I can't save money in the bank because it's going to be found by my husband or whoever, so I will use a rock, you know, and I will educate my children based on hiding money under a rock. So having had these conversations with women in villages and all of that, I realized that, they also have spaces where they work from, like art centers, old age homes and all of that, and they work with beads. So I realized that, you know, we could have these conversations and these stories, and which we are not allowed, we don't have the spaces to talk about at. So use our beads, our art in expressing what we wanted to express, like Kununzizi, in our own way, and be killjoys in different ways, right? So then take the beads and turn it into something else that will question, that will disrupt and still, you know, be in the same spaces that they work at. And so Uzondikonsisa came from basically having conversations with women and then having a platform where we can actually open these conversations to other people that will come and listen, and then perform the beads or whatever in whatever way that they wanted to do it, without having that whole cloud hanging over you that you are not allowed to do this because you are in this space, and you're not allowed to say this because you're in a marginal state, right? So it came from that, and that was the exhibition.
So, I mean, do you consider yourself a bit of an Imbongi? Do you consider yourself a bit of an Imbongi?
Well, in a sense, probably, because I try and find ways to do what I want. I think I would, because I do think that I do have that trickster thing in me where where if I'm not allowed to do this, then I'll find a way to do it. Like Kununzizi, I mean, if you say you're not allowed, I'm going to find a way to do it, even if it's discreet. But I will find some way of voicing out what I do want to voice out in whatever way that I find appropriate.
So Nonso, in your article, Practicing a Few Notes on Curatorial Training in Africa, you say, and I quote, "The meaning of the word curator has shifted so much so that it no longer denotes one straightforward thing, but a constellation of conglomerate things that define a process, an approach, or way of being that is sometimes seen to serve a criteria, but at the same time adaptable enough to be acclaimed by anyone who wishes," unquote. The word curate, of course, is in Latin. It means to take care of. So can you talk about the constellation of what it means to be a curator today, all of you? And what does curating mean for each of you, and what and whom are you taking care of?
No, I think since you're the...
I'm so impressed by my question.
She knows what she's talking about.
Well, I mean, I think there's an interest in speaking to a practice that is about thinking through a series of ideas and constantly how we are creating a meeting place, a meeting of between a meeting of things that speak between each other, and whether we do that in our personal spaces or whether we're doing it consciously within a gallery space, there is a way in which it begins to enable an ordering of thought, putting forward a question, and asking for people to meet you at a particular place to speak to a series of questions, and that's how I view curating. And of course, then there is a wider interest in a lot of people sort of engaging with this practice beyond just the visual art. So the taking care of, and I constantly talk about this triangulation of curating, where you are negotiating the artist, the institution, and the public, and how in negotiating these three elements, your role is to create an encounter and a meeting place that allows for a very fruitful engagement, that allows for asking questions that are not always obvious in the everyday. And then, of course, that in a way becomes a taking care of. How do we take care of these spaces that enable us to ask these questions? But of course, there is the kind of institutional taking care of collections, of so that comes from that space of kind of conservation and looking after collections. But I was in that essay, I was interested in provoking this idea that there is a practice that we do both consciously and unconsciously in our everyday, but there's also a practice that is calling us into understanding a visual practice that I engage with.
You see? Okay, sorry. I think it's a lot has shifted from what the work I did with Fantastic, and then after that was facilitation of a curatorial project with Valerie Jethalev, which was more about having people in the space and having people change the space whichever way they wanted to. And it happened during the time of during a time when the art campus was occupied by the Umhlangano movement, and it was planned before that. I think it happened almost at around the same time as the Helen Sibidi that didn't happen, and eventually became the space where we said, okay, as you are protesting over a long period of time, let the space become the space for the conversation, the dialogue, and this changing process. And that exhibition changed almost every day, because people moved things and they ate and they slept and they woke up the next day and would shift one object from one place to another. And I think that's become a very exciting prospect of what curating means for me. Not just working with artworks as objects, but working with these social processes. So the Pamela Patimo Sandstrom exhibition that just closed, I think it came down Tuesday, that Nkule and myself Nkule mostly put together. Was also part of just inviting Pamela to come into the space, engage with its context, and have people come in and work on it collaboratively. So the focus is more on that process than it is about the finished, pristine exhibition. And so I think there's, it's quite a leap from what Fantastic was, but I think that's sort of become, for me, the idea of caring has become that, curating being about creating the social spaces that don't quite easily fit into the framework of the institution.
I think I've been placed in a very interesting position. Well, now that my engagement with curating is somewhat, I think, determined in a very particular way, because of course I work for a bank, and the space that has historical kind of privilege in a way. But just as an example, I had the other day I had an elderly, he's a photographer, he's a street photographer actually, and he's been photographing for years in Newtown. And he decided to come in and, asked to speak to me, just to find out, for instance, how to go about having an exhibition in the gallery. But he started first by telling me that, I've walked past this gallery for 5 years now, deliberately. I've walked past. It was only when I saw that you had been appointed that I decided to walk in. And I mean, that placed a whole lot of responsibility on me, and I kind of thought, okay, and that's where the question of, who are you curating for comes in. And for me, it was like, okay, regardless of this heavy responsibility that I feel has been placed on me, what then do I do with, this responsibility of, the general public that have, or people who have felt they've felt unwelcome in this space? How do I then create a space that is welcoming? And that's been I think something that I've been thinking about quite deeply. I haven't arrived at the answer yet, but as a way of starting to look at ways of how I could start grappling with it, I always use the example of the Obama portraits and what they must look like in the Smithsonian, with 43 other presidents before that, and then these portraits, which even in their making, right, the artists that painted Michelle and Obama are black artists. So and thinking about now there's whole queues of people coming to see those portraits, because it means they're, where they've been placed says something about what has changed, I think, in that. And for me, that's always been a moment to think about, because it speaks about that finally people have something that they identify with, or someone that looks like them in the space. And that for me is, I think, what I'm grappling with.
I think I arrive at my curating sort of on a relational basis, and sort of taking care of people and ideas, as opposed to objects and things, which what curating generally is. And this is basically because the Michaelis doesn't, the gallery doesn't have a collection to be taken care of, and the collection that it does have is not necessarily under my purview. So
that's a whole story there.
A whole story, yeah. And so I mean, what that allows for me to do is then be able to think about how does then one support the people who are coming up with the ideas and the work in that space. And so how do I become a sort of maybe a conduit in a way, but also a collaborator and a supporter to bring ideas into that space, and sort of also allow whoever is in that space to realize what they would like to realize, sort of not putting myself putting myself as in the background of supporting that project and realizing it to its best potential within what I have the resources to do. So yeah, and so that's a very wide way of basically saying that it's I'm open to collaboration. So, and if you've, but I'll just plug this quickly. Sorry, Sharlene. I mean, we do accept proposals at Michaelis, and we look at them, and we do try to support them as far as possible. So I am genuinely saying, if you do have something you'd like to do, I'm here.
Okay, so in terms of taking care of, I am in the experimental process of creating exhibitions that are mainly accessible to everybody, because I feel like for me...
With no money. That's what your experimentalism means. You still have the freedom.
Yeah, so mainly making art accessible to everyone, and so being inclusive, mainly because I know that when I went to study art, everyone in my community did not get that what is it, and if there is a student exhibition, nobody goes because it's their things. So we normally I feel like we curate for ourselves as artists, and are not inclusive of everybody else because we somehow complicate it, and then mostly, and then we're not inclusive of everyone. And so I've learned that working in the spaces that I work in, I mainly work at an art center, Gombo Art Center in Duncan Village. There you have to kind of create with an understanding that not everybody understands what you're actually doing. And so it's a learning space. I'm learning while I'm doing, but I'm also aware of the fact that I am working with not everybody that I work with is an artist, and so that's what I want my work to kind of represent everybody. So when you say who am I taking care of, I will say everybody, even to include the marginalized spaces as well, and so that's what I'm always aware of whenever I'm trying to put on a show or.
So in the 90s and the 2000s, if you asked me for a black woman curator, the only name I could come up with possibly was Bongi Tloko Maklao, right? And now we're at the point where we can just rattle off names: Natasha, Rafiwe, Tato, Portia, Sekumoto, Idioma, Joan, Melissa, and of course Gabi is like, completely international now. So black women have made quite a headway from South Africa in terms of curatorship. That doesn't erase the fact that curating is such a challenge. And so what are the and I am aware that when we're talking to an audience like this, that there are art students in here, that there are people that are possibly thinking if this could be a career for them. What are the very real challenges you face as black women curators and creative producers?
Having to be pitted against commercial galleries, I think there's something quite toxic about the way commercial galleries do things. It's hard for us to get into them, but once you're in there, but also then, you try and carve alternative spaces, which aren't always easy to get the same kind of currency and engagement in the same way as commercial galleries do. So I think, it's still that. I think that's still for me a major challenge.
Well, when I started out, I was also working in a very alternative space, Bed Center, and to kind of think about the possibilities of working outside of that and imagining yourself engaging in a particular kind of professional space. I found that my gender was a question. And also your experience counted a lot. Artists will look at particular names that are known rather than someone who's saying, you're a curator, what do you know? You work for what? Best Center, and all of those things being kind of a layer in making possible what you could do. And of course, funding and that being a challenge. And as Nomusa was saying, that you are without funding, without a particular reputation, and going to a gallery, and you know, of course, when an international curator doesn't have to be ticking all those boxes. You just say, I'm from Paris and I'm from the US, and you are getting catered for. It's very difficult to then imagine possibilities of working in particular ways. And again, I wanted to say to your earlier question is that there is a particular question around, and that essay was a provocation to say there is ethical questions and a practice that speaks to and demands for ethical questions, because of course we know artists have been exploited, because anybody comes and they can call themselves a curator, and that also means that you are eventually dealing with other difficulties of artists being hesitant to work with people, or also producing certain things without necessarily thinking, not just about artists, as of course we've heard the ideas people are presenting there, but who is engaging with your ideas and how that also speaks to and invokes a particular ethical practice. Yeah.
I think for me the biggest challenge has been this kind of tokenizing of black women curators, and where, you know, it's hard to tell, for instance, if you are being invited as on the basis of your own merit and the value that you will add to the project, as opposed to when are you being used to legitimize a project, you know. And that's always been, I think, a big challenge, making it out and really kind of negotiating that in your head, because of course you want to, you know, curate so that you have experience and, you know, you put something on your CV that is credible, but that questioning of am I being tokenized here, am I being used to legitimize something, it's always been a challenge.
Yeah, so basically what Nonto said. And then in addition to that, about being not trusted, because anybody can say that they're a curator. And so before arriving at Michaelis, it's sort of like, was so hard to try and do anything at all, because it's somehow you have to prove first that you can, I don't know what you have to prove. You have to prove something. And this something that you must prove is based on having access to some other thing, which you don't have the access to the other thing, which you need access to the other thing to know the thing that must be the thing that you need to show. Like, yeah, sorry, we're joking.
I totally agree with you. Because I think mostly with my experience it's applying for funding and then not being trusted, exactly like you said, and needing experience, which you need funding for. I mean, where are you going to get this experience when nobody is funding you based on the fact that you are a black woman, you know what I mean? And you somehow cannot be trusted, which is weird, because black women have done so much with little money, you know? So I think the funding thing is a thing, because in order to have this experience that is needed, you need the funding. So then that means you're not going to eventually get to that space where you are now experienced and trusted, because, you know, how do you get there? That's mostly the challenge.
So I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to limit it to 2 more. So again, referring to that Ngone article, she says, despite difficult circumstances, African women have been able throughout the ages to maintain a space of freedom for themselves. Today, art is the new weapon for preserving and enlarging that free zone. Female African artists explore the challenges of the world without complacence. Vigilant, they exhume demons, hunt down preconceptions, scatter taboos, and are unafraid to reveal our darker fears. Their art is a metaphor, an ongoing transgression of all that is forbidden. And even when lyrical or delicate, it marks a radical rupture with the idea of an African feminine art supposed to be pretty and never disturbing or challenging. My question to you is, what are the zones of freedom that curating has opened up for you?
Start that side.
So our first contestant, Ms. Eastern Cape, will answer that question.
Sorry, can you please repeat it again? See, I was going to listen to all of y'all's answers, now I'm stuck.
Judge 1-0. What are the zones of freedom that curating has opened up for you?
I think having done the few that I've done exhibitions, I think it's exactly what I was talking about in being a trickster, is in being able to through my curation allow conversations that are not allowed to happen in those spaces, you know. So yeah, that's what I've gained from it, and that's what I've purposefully tried to put in place to allow our voices to be able to express whatever it is that we wanted to express even in societies where it is often muted.
And it's an extension of the sort of like being able to bring in people who otherwise would not have been able to come in to that space previously, or even if they had made it and it was under sort of various other guises that did not allow them to have their full power in that space. And being able to do things that you like to do, actually with people that you like. And, oh, so funny, sorry. Yeah, but it's very important because, I mean, the rest of the time you're fighting funny institutions, and you need that. Like, that's an outlet to say, okay, sure, I'm fighting the rest of the time, but in the meantime, I also get to do something that is pleasurable for me, and go somewhere.
And you do it with a whole soundtrack of 90s R&B.
You know, you've been in my office.
Yeah, the free zone. I think for me, definitely, curating has, in the beginning, I mean, I said that I landed upon it by accident, but I think it's more of, there's certain things, for instance, I can't articulate through writing or making, and they're expressed better through a curatorial, engagement, because of the nature of what it is. So for me, that's been liberating. But also, I think the allowance for intellectual engagement as well, that I think can be limitations. For instance, in theoretical kind of work, even in making work as a black female, it's hard to escape the rubrics that you're put in. Whereas with curating, I think there's something that kind of refuses that. I'm not sure if it's the agency that, as a curator, you kind of claim in just being that, but also maybe even that you've empowered yourself to becoming the source of telling something or telling a particular story. So yeah.
I'll say three things. The first thing would be being a lifetime student. Of course, we know that artists make art about the world, really about everything that happens in our everyday. So one discovers history, one discovers so many other fantastic things through art. And then, of course, the opportunity to make friends through that. So making people you grow with, and have the choice to engage people's work you really like, and at the same time learning, of course. And then, of course, an extension of my own creative practice. So people who are in getting those friends, you are getting people who are allowing you to expand your own creativity. So, an exhibition space, whether in a gallery outside, is that 3D visualization. It's about creating that experience, and that for me is an extension of my creativity.
Yeah, what Nkule said. I think in our collaborative projects, it's always been the relief. It's like, oh, we can do what we want to do. This is a hard project. Which, I've never found that freedom in the Works of Art Committee. It's always because the collection belongs to everybody. And everybody has an idea of what must happen to it. And so and you can't please everybody. And so you have less freedom. You move one thing from here to there, someone is bound to complain. So it's harder to find that freedom doing more sort of formal curatorial work than it is with the independent projects, where you can choose, the spaces you want to work in, you can choose the people you want to work with, you can choose the artworks you want to, and you can begin to sort of rail against, work against the grain. But yeah, I think for me that's always been but also because a lot of my, I think I should also say the same thing with Nkule, that someone said that it was accidental, but also because it's my involvement in curating has always come from my work in art history. So I've always drawn from an art historical project into curating, and then out comes another written theoretical, so it's always a sort of cycle between writing and curating. And I think that's where I find my freedoms.
Okay, so final question. Like I said, there's tons of questions I can ask you about the local, global market, about knowledge production via the kinds of practice that you do, your relationalities with communities and with artists themselves and with markets. But the question I want to end with is really, what is the role and potential of the imagination?
Limitless. What's the role?
The role of imagination.
And the potential.
Of course, the potential is limitless. It is up to you what you do with the creativity. And role can be subjective. I guess I'm avoiding the answer, but so I'm just going to say role is subjective to what it is that you intend with your creative work and creative practice, and so the outcomes of that will vary, but it's really based on the intention. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. No, for real. Yeah, I think the role of the imagination. Yeah, I think it's being able to create for the future. I don't know if I'm making sense. So in the curatorial form, being able to creatively archive the present. Yeah.
For me, the role of the imagination, in terms of curating, I would say, I would say if I was a 6-year-old girl right now, what kind of a space would I want to see? A gallery space, what would I want to see in there? And what kind of world, would I imagine as, that space creating for me, if you know what I mean.
Everything starts with imagination, then things are possible, and then of course budgets determine how much you can imagine. Of course, without this possibility of being able to use or imagine things, we wouldn't be able to produce what we produced.
Yeah, I think it plays an important role in enabling you to work against convention. So you're able to think I mean, imagination is important to enable you to not say, okay, this is how you curate, and so therefore I shall curate in the way that people have always curated, you know. So it sort of allows you a little bit more freedom outside of convention. You know, I mean, I think a lot of people, sometimes the first question they ask is, you know, could you have imagined yourself as an artist, having grown up in a place where people couldn't even imagine black women, I mean, you know, which, I mean, I think it's not true to a certain extent that there were no black women artists, or so we could never imagine ourselves, but we do come from the kind of social spaces where it's assumed that, you know, we can't even imagine a woman working in the arts, or a black woman working in the arts. So it's been important to establish the sort of new terrains and work against convention.
Thank you for that. Many years ago, when racism pushed me out of the art field, and I was working as a personal assistant to the director of graduate school, in the few moments that I wasn't getting coffee and writing all the emails and stuff, I would be plotting out events that I would have someday. One of those was Afems. The other was these kinds of conversations with these really amazing women that I really would like to publicly thank for the courage of your imaginations, for your intellectual generosity, and for the ways in which you build up knowledge, you build up history, and you take care of other women as well. And so I really want to thank you for that. And it really is an honor knowing people like you and many other women that I've named that are literally making history. I also secondly want to thank the Art on Our Mind team. All of this wouldn't be possible without our volunteers. And they're all over the place. You'll see them with their little shirts. Really, you know, people say, oh, you're doing such great work, but my work is not possible without this entire team of undergraduate and postgraduate scholars who give up their time. And so I really, really want to thank them from the bottom of my heart, because this all is possible. This history making, this world making is possible because of this team. I also want to thank my, you know, Linda Spencer as well, who is my partner in crime in the Afems and creating these kinds of platforms where we can discuss and discourse. And so I want to thank you for being the audience. We need audiences, but right now we're just going to take a few questions before we finish.
Hi. Thank you, that was very interesting, and also inspiring. But just, maybe this is not even a question, but like a rant, I've gone a rant. So, we've been talking a lot about margins, people who are outside margins, and how as black women curators, you kind of think of making people in the margins visible. This kind of seems like the theme of some of the work that you do. But I'm going to speak as someone who's in the margins and say, I do still see a gap. We've been talking a lot about hypervisibility, and that this is like a moment for black women. Right? We're hot right now, everybody wants to talk about being a black woman or a black pain and all that stuff. And it's kind of taking off, right? But there are still artists and activists who are not being visible in that sense. In my case, I'm just gonna talk about queerness and just this idea even of not even fully identifying with that black woman banner. Right, this canon that's taking off. And I don't know if I'm asking or just suggesting even, that maybe if we're talking about margins, that we even need to consider that we are centering ourselves still, right? By saying black woman, that's still a centering of sorts and still leaves a lot of people out of that category. And as somebody who is active, like as someone in the margins who isn't necessarily always counted in that banner, I can say even this idea of the funding that, you know, Like there is a whole world of people getting funding to do this work by Black women, and a whole lot of people who aren't getting that funding. And I'm in that crew over there. And we are doing this work regardless. We're doing this work without funding, and we can see clearly that there's another world of Black women there doing the work with funding, right? So I just want to put that in there to say that as much as we are becoming more inclusive, we are getting the stage, there's still a huge group of people who are maybe even underneath us in that whole food chain that aren't getting that visibility and they aren't even going to be palatable. So if you were to like propose that, you wouldn't get the funding because it's not what the institution wants to see Black women as necessarily. So I mean, yeah, just a note. Maybe even a question if somebody wants to respond to that.
I can't remember your name, I'm so sorry. You mentioned about how anyone can call themselves a curator that's there, and it brings a lot of trust and the ethics of it. If any of you would I don't know if I got the sense that there should be a standard, because you're taking care of somebody's work or you're dealing with an artist in some form. What kind of standard do you imagine should be in place? Like, what standard would you institute in being able to say that, there's an ethical treatment in curatorship and a curatorial practice? And I can just sneak in another question. When you get to a certain part of your career or the end of your career and looking back at your practice, what would make you feel satisfied? What accomplished something that you had achieved? Like, what's your, if I could do one thing, I would do that thing?
Okay, mine is not a question, mine is a contribution, and it's directed to the second speaker on red. I just want to encourage you. I can see that the Black woman has different challenges and different structures. Please, I want to say this as a sister. Whatever project you have, don't wait for anybody. Don't wait for anybody to fund you because you already know you are Black. In fact, by the time... So, by your color alone, when I'm saying you are Black, I'm also referring... Please, I hope you understand what I'm saying. I'm also referring to myself. I already know that I am a Black woman, and I already know that before I say anything, the Black thing will come up. So what I'm trying to say is to equip you, know who you are, know that of course they're going to reject me, so refuse to be rejected, the power of imagination. I want to say in very clear terms, there are people who believe in you and people who believe in your dreams. I believe in collaborative effort. Start with one person, one woman who believes in you. Put the little resources you have together. From that one woman who believes in you, another person, you know what I mean? Another third person will come in. And before you know, gradually, let me take it from a biblical perspective. Isaiah 1 verse 18. Come, let us reason together. Come. So that idea of, and a practical example is Sharlene and Dr. Linda Spencer. Two different women in two different departments. They believed in themselves. Just know that, look, I've always told myself the truth. Nobody is interested in me, so I'm interested in myself. I moved on. Sorry, you know what I was saying? I'm able to say this because this is a woman's space. I will not say it, because that's my weapon. I already know you're going to reject me, so I don't bother. When I was coming from my PhD, the men got the funding, I did not, because she's a woman. Sit down here, make babies. Sit down here, make babies. You want to go to South Africa to come and sit down here. We have professors to train me. What did I do? Sell some things, picked up the little thing I had, and in my third year. Some women are still there waiting for whatever, because I just know nothing. I am going. You die once. If I die, I go to heaven or hell, but I'm going. So I'm trying to equip, if you have that very strong power of imagination, believe in yourself, believe in your dreams, and move on. Sorry, let me give this other example. When I was going to America, they said no funding. So I told them I'd go travel. Sorry to say this. The university released 15,000 and the ticket was 14,000. That meant is either you take it or you leave it. So I went to Go Travels and told Go Travels, if you're going to put me in a boat on top of a fly, you know, inside the cupboard of somebody's bag to get to that place, please do it. But what I know is this conference I am going to attend. So believe in yourself, move on, look for somebody, believe in God, just move, and before you know, the whole world will move along with you. Thank you.
I want to ask, because I think a lot of you spoke about the art making and curating, you know, in the space where you put up artworks. I want to ask about the writing side. I think, Nkule, you've done that, finding art alternatives to curate, not only just artist making, but also art, like in publishing in a way, and in inviting writers, and also in colloquiums, because you guys have also, I think, curated colloquiums, and those decisions within putting up an exhibition, wouldn't you say that those are other alternatives that you would say are open to curate?
Hello. There was this article, I think it was Dr. Khan in our class last year, if I'm not mistaken, by Professor Pumla Gola. Iti ufanele ukavile. It talks about how black women have actually always had agency. They have been written about, yes, but they have always had their own agency. But that is not written about. So until they write their own stories, then that could be spoken about. So in the sense of curating, so I work with these women. So last year there was the Eastern Cape Craft Collection that is done by the Department of Arts and Culture, right? And in the Eastern Cape there would be about 38 artists that they call crafters. They come from villages in the Eastern Cape, and these women, so they get one curator to actually come and curate the space that they're going to be. There would be one main tent where there would be 20 artists who would normally go to your decorexes and whatnot, and then there would be the other 16 in various tentes around the village in the National Arts Festival. So they would get one person to curate this space for these women who are between 38 and 40. And they complained last year. In fact, they have been complaining that why are you getting this one person that you pay so many thousands, whereas we don't benefit when we come here. We leave our families for 11 days. We don't get stipends. We are supposed to be grateful for the space that we've been given, but in actual fact, we are artists and we can curate our own spaces. So in one particular space in Musha, there's 118 villages. And my argument is that there is supposedly one artist in each village, which make up 118 artists, right? So, and most of them, they can curate themselves, but they need people like you to actually come to those spaces and work with them. So, because they are denied these opportunities to actually be their own curators of their own shows, you know. I think somebody spoke about Nomusa Makhubu curating herself, removing herself from the center to go into this alternative space. So would you guys, because we are talking about this now in this kind of institution, right? And so a lot of these artists who may want to curate, who may want to listen what you have to say, are not here to hear this. So, and I mean, as long as you are black women, right? So as long as you continue to work in these spaces, which you are needed very much, like your Standard Bank Art Gallery, your UCT, and Rhodes University, is there a way maybe you would think about forming an alternative space to actually work with these kind of women who may want to take their desire to curate further? Because some of them can't get to this institution. A lot of them would have loved to be here to listen to you talk, and then they would have, you know, their agency would have doubled to say, oh my God, here's a black woman who's sitting there, I can do this, you know. So can we also have maybe in the next conference talk about maybe a way that you as the 5 women sitting there and other people who are interested, forming alternative institutions where these other women who may want to curate can access these kind of spaces, and they can be part of the conversation going forward.
Okay. I'll try and answer even, and then I'll pass on the mic. With this position comes responsibility, and for me, I take this kind of job with very seriously, in a sense that it is about being careful and caring. As you've heard, and constantly my reference to the artist, because we as curators have a responsibility to the taking care of the artist. And again, I think that part of the thing that's evolved over time is this carelessness, right? The carelessness towards the artist that is the person you are collaborating with in producing exhibition. So in doing this kind of job, and hence my provocation around ethics, is that your first responsibility is the artist, and you need to be faithful to their ideas as close as possible, even in the imagining of what you are able to produce. You are being required to. And of course, the curator only becomes visible today because there's transnational curators, and this limelight of the individual who organizes has come with other problems of celebrity making that has made people careless about the responsibility that they have towards the artist, towards the institution. A lot of the time, 80% of what you do as a curator is administrative. The 20% is that glory looking nice with black shoes and very fancy. That's the 20% and the imagining of the possibility of the project. So when it comes to actually the doing of the project, you are doing the grinding work, you're doing the cleaning of the toilets, the cleaning of the space, to making sure that artists are there, their work is there, their work is represented in the way that they want to be represented. And of course, because people have been irresponsible, we are also going into a terrain that has now fought with problems and contestations, how artists have been really angry with curators who have come and exploited them. So how do you negotiate, even with this gendered body, into a space that is already contested, into a practice that has done damage in the way that the field has worked? So in it comes with this big responsibility, and that yes, we might sound like we're making it sound sexy, and the space is there. There's a possibility you can be anything that you imagine yourself to be, but in doing that, you need to be responsible in entering into that space. So what are those standards? For me, I think that the standards are being redrawn, but they are redrawn being, let us do this knowing that we need to be careful and be responsible and familiar, know the history that exists, that you know that you're walking into a space where curators have done this kind of damage. So how do you not repeat those mistakes? And of course, thank you, Joy. I take the support, and of course, all you do is wake up and do and make it possible. And in my work, at some point at the end of the Mdluli exhibition, I was like, oh God, I'm going to become the curator that curates women artists, and I don't want that tag, because that's not all that I do. And I've worked for over 17 years in an institution working with artists and works of a variety. So that carries, but I have a soft spot for this particular position because every day is how I've negotiated my space. So I do spend a little bit of time working with other women artists. The current show that I did in Cape Town was to see 10 artists from across the world, women artists, to present their work in that kind of context. So one is constantly producing and working, but working responsibly. And I think that, and of course, I believe in multiplicity. As 5, it's not enough. It's a big world, and there should be more people working in this way. And so I have 2 beautiful students here with me, Sihle and Rashida, whom know very well that my academic life, and I hesitate, as Sharlene was saying, hesitate to call myself an academic or an art historian, because I think my job and my presence there is more of an activist. There's a bigger role of making sure that we are multiplying in these spaces, so that we're not talking of ourselves in the margins. We are the center, and we should be claiming that centered space.
I feel like you've answered everything.
Yeah, I think it's also important that as we are entering that central space, that we are always cognizant of the fact that we could easily become the next gatekeepers, right? We share the burden of representation. We have our own interests, but then we're supposed to represent everything, which is just impossible. And I know that what I hear from a lot of people in the institutions, people think institutions are glamorous, but they really make us sick. They make us physically and mentally ill. They drive you to the edge. And so people see the sexiness of this, but then they don't see how much it takes, the emotional and physical and mental toll it takes on us to sustain ourselves, to continue to be in those institutions, to hold space. But at the same time, we always have to be cognizant that we will be the next gatekeepers in a way, and how we negotiate that role. How do we allow access? And that for every center, there's a margin, and that margin has a margin, and that margin has a margin. And it's a lot of work. I'm tired. Thank you very much again for your engagement, for attending. Cocktail dinner, enjoy yourselves. Tomorrow, there's the Art Around Mind talk at 2 p.m. with Shelley Barry and Beverly Barry, which we're really looking forward to.
Just a small announcement.